Why did Jesus sacrifice himself for us? So the short answer to this is to save us, to bring us salvation. Now, the long answer to this is unfortunately incredibly complicated, and it requires us to go into some theology here. Now, I want to start off with a major asterisk and say that what I'm going to say is one theory among many. This whole idea is called soteriology. It's a study of salvation. What does it mean for Christ to save us? Why did Christ have to suffer the way that he did? And there's many, many different viewpoints. Personally, I follow what's called the recapitulation theory of atonement. However, there's also probably the most famous of all the various soteriology is the penal substitution model. So I'm going to talk about those two things and why I favor recapitulation theory versus penal substitution model. So, why did Christ sacrifice himself to save us? This is so incredibly difficult to fathom. In the recapitulation theory of atonement, what it says is Christ enters into what is human to bring us salvation. So the reason why Christ suffered, why he endured the cross, why he was abandoned by his friends, why he entered into isolation, why he entered into all of the mockery and rejection, is that Christ was entering into the consequences of sin. He was entering into what sin does. In your own life, you can see this. Sin usually brings about isolation, pain, mockery, feelings of desolation, of feeling completely abandoned by all. That's the consequences of sin. The wages of sin are death, as St. Paul tells us. And so Christ, in his humanity, brings his divinity into contact with the wound of humanity, that we enter into contact with what we have done to ourselves. To use what some of the ancient church fathers used, the image of ancient church fathers used, Christ goes into the grave to seek after lost Adam. Christ sacrifices himself. Christ says yes, even to the point of pain and death on the cross, to rectify what has happened in sin. You might think of it like this. If you have a wound on your arm, let's say, and it's bleeding and it's getting infected, you could put a bandage over all of it. That's kind of what the Old Testament was, to keep it from bleeding, to keep it from going out. But you also need to address the underlying problem. You need to address what the sin does. And so in Christ entering into the consequences of sin, and entering into the isolation, the pain, death itself, Christ is like a needle that enters into that wound and delivers the antibiotic, that delivers the cure, and so brings about salvus, salvation, health, because the word salvus in Latin literally means health. It returns us, broken humanity, back into health. So Christ does what humanity must do, say yes even in the face of all of these things, but that only God could do, to use the terms of St. Anselm. Now, that's one theory of why Christ sacrificed himself. The more common theory, and the theory that I really don't like, this is a personal thing, so if you like this theory, you feel free to hold on to it. This is just me speaking my opinion on this matter. The more common theory, the one that you'll hear quite often, is the penal substitution model of atonement. You see this quite clearly in Martin Luther in his commentary on Galatians chapter 3. And in the penal substitution theory of atonement, Christ becomes not just a person who suffers, but sin itself. Christ becomes sin. So in his commentary on Galatians, Martin Luther says that Christ becomes the greatest blasphemer, murderer, adulterer, and thief out of all of the world, that God the Father rightly punishes him because God's justice requires that punishment be given. And so Christ takes sin upon himself, he becomes sin, and the Father justly punishes Christ as the sinner, as the sin itself. Now, personally, I don't think this makes a lot of sense. First off, how could justice be rendered by arbitrarily substituting in another person? That's like saying, okay, this person did some crime and needs to go to jail for it, and then someone else saying, well, I'll go to jail for him, and that prisoner goes off scot-free. Like, that's not justice. It's not giving someone their due. And so to hear that Christ is tortured, isolated, and killed to satisfy God's justice, that just doesn't make sense to me. And so now I do recognize there is arguments that can be made in favor of this idea of the penal substitution model of atonement. Personally, I'm not a big fan of it. And I think the recapitulation theory of Christ entering into what we are, entering into the depths of the consequences of sin so as to save us from those consequences, that makes far more sense to me. Because he takes what he assumes and assumes what he heals. He takes even our death and so brings about a healing there, that the cause of our downfall might become the means of our salvation, as we say in preface number 4, if memory serves, in the Mass. So, long answer to a short question. Why did Jesus sacrifice himself for us? To save us. Personally, I follow the recapitulation theory of atonement, in which Christ saves and heals the effects of sin by entering into those effects and bringing about salvation.